listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. My name is Dave Patterson. I'll be the host for today's webinar on the NSF sponsorship landscape and on working on developing a valuation plan for your NSF. We're joined today by two excellent speakers, Elisa Basselt from T1 Marketing Agency, as well as by Norm O'Reilly, who's a Richard and Joan S. Fox Professor of Management at Ohio University. I will give you just a quick introduction to our tool today so that you're comfortable with communicating with us. You can see us right now, but don't worry, we can't see you. You will be muted as an audience member throughout the day today. That is to avoid dogs and baristas and what have you in the background. So because you're muted, but we do want to hear from you, please look over on the right-hand side of your screen. You can use the chat window there to ask a question at any time. I will field those questions and ask them on your behalf. Also on the right-hand side of the screen is a handout tab. If you click on that, you can download the deck that we're presenting here today right now. So you'll have access to that immediately. So again, if there are any questions, we'd love to hear from you at any point. We will save time for questions at the end as well. But at any point along this way, we'd love to hear from you and be able to answer any of your questions and to benefit the whole group from whatever it is we're able to share through those questions. So with that, it's going to be my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. O'Reilly. Norm, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Patterson, for having us today. And actually, Elisa and I are going to go back and forth on the presentation to take everyone through and keep it a little more vibrant and interactive to keep you paying attention. So Elisa is actually going to kick it off and take us through the first few slides, and we're going to go back and forth. So over to you, Elisa.
Perfect. Thanks, Norm. So to begin, we just really wanted to go back and kind of set the stage for where we're coming from. In terms of the research and all of that kind of process, we just really wanted to say thank you for those of you that participated in the survey and in the sessions. It was really, really helpful. We got a lot of really great data and really great information. And it really helped us build some great clusters, some great valuation, and hopefully some strategy that will really lend some insight to each of you moving forward as you build and structure your sponsorship overall. And then I just also wanted to mention a little bit on confidentiality. So as we mentioned at the outset, we didn't share any information specific to your NSF with the COC, and we won't do that. If you do have specific questions or things that you'd like to ask here, please go ahead. But then also, if you have questions afterwards that you'd like to speak with us directly on, we're happy to take those as well. Just ask us. So in terms of the timing and the approach, we just, as I said, wanted to recap where we've come from. So back in November, Norm had the opportunity to talk to many of you and give you a little bit of heads up in terms of this sponsorship valuation coming down the pipeline for many of you, which led us to two sessions in February, one in Ottawa, one in Calgary, where we were able to walk you through sort of a day-long sponsorship exercise. We shared some information about sponsorship from our organization. We took you through some insight from the sponsorship landscape study, and then we had the opportunity to hear some of your great ideas from some of the exercises that we walked through. That was also an opportunity for us to tell you about the survey and how that would work. So that survey was open from, I believe it was February 1st to March 1st. Once we closed the survey, we did a number of analyses on it, and we built the reports. We had a overall report for the COC, and then we had the custom reports that went directly to each NSF. Then we wanted to give you May to kind of digest the report, have a read through it, share it around, and then that leads us to today where we're going to kind of walk you through particularly the analysis and the strategy component, but also give you the opportunity, as Dave mentioned at the beginning, to answer any questions that you may have. So just in terms of that approach, really quickly, we wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page with the objectives, and that was really to provide some insight into the NSF sponsorship valuation that you have. We also looked into internal and external research, so that was kind of from the survey. We did some primary and secondary research on our own, so we'll walk you through some of that. The NSF analysis, so that's the survey and that's that great information that you provided to us. We were able to take that data and then put it in sort of analyze it through the benchmarking that we undertook to really build clusters and then share with you where you fell in those clusters and hopefully provide both the valuation but also some strategy, which leads us to number 5 there in terms of how you can continue to build on your successes and perhaps see greater success.
Great. So I'm going to take you through the first phase of the analysis now that Elisa mentioned. And as you all were part of, I think maybe a few people have joined today who weren't part of this process, and that's why we did take a few minutes to kind of outline what we did across the board. What the first step was then was secondary research, and we got a lot of data from sources that are publicly available, from your own annual reports, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we looked at the 49 sports that the COC recognizes that are NSFs, and that's the list of the 49 in front of you. And this is after our webinars, but before we got to really dig into your individual personalized data for those on the call that did participate in all of the steps of the deeper dive and the strategy development. So what we wanted to do here was say, okay, there's these 49 NSFs. We're all, from a sponsorship perspective, very different, and as a lot of us I mentioned in the first talk, and we said along the way, we're very excited to get a chance to do this because we've all worked and been a part of David Patterson, Elisa and I both, of a number of NSFs. This is really interesting to look at, and we know a lot of you have these needs from previous webinars and experiences. And so we looked at all 49 and said, okay, from what we know, how can we actually break you down? Again, this is secondary data only. And so we did the secondary one that then led to the primary and then led to the kind of the specific benchmarking that we wanted to undertake. So you can flip the slide. On the next slide, you can see this is where we came up with on secondary research. And we showed you a preliminary version of this when we met at the seminars, and we've adapted it. Now we've changed it significantly. And so what we did in terms of the factors is we built a set of data. There are 24 different variables that we've grouped into 10 factors using a factor analysis across the 49 NSF. So what that means quite simply is we looked at as many things as we possibly could that could differentiate you, an NSF, from a sponsorship perspective, so what value you're providing back to your sponsor. That could be number of Twitter followers, number of past Olympic medalists, that could be your reach and how often you're on television, that could be your number of paid members, that could be estimates of the number of people that informally play your sport in Canada each year, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And those 24 variables led us to the 10 factors you see below. And these are quite interesting, and these, as you all know, are levers that you can then leverage to increase your sponsorship of value, attract some sponsors, think about some in-kind support, those kind of things. So we had exposure. So some of you have really high exposure at major events, others very limited assets that you can sell as part of sponsorship. So your equipment, is it expensive to play? Is it something that there's a lot of endemic sponsorship possible? Think about a skates in hockey or a suit in speed skating versus other sports that may not have as much stuff. That you think about diving, very limited apparel that the athletes wear. A capacity in terms of your revenue of your overall organization. Are you part of a very successful NSF with a big revenue base, or are you a very small kitchen table across the board? What sport are you in? How popular is it, with a bunch of variables across that landscape? Events, do you have grassroots events? Are there things that each weekend Canadians participate in, or their kids participate in, or their families would go to watch that are part of your sport, or is there nothing? Do you host any mega events? Do you have some special events in Canada that year over year attract large audiences and would have sponsorship value, not necessarily for the NSF, but for your sport overall? Your reputation, are you a charitable sport? What about the athlete risk, the concussion issues we've talked about recently, for example? A global reputation, are you a sport like cricket that has a big global reputation but very limited following in Canada, or something like hockey that is a huge passionate base here? Performance, both current success, Olympic champions, Olympic medalists, Olympic champions, world championships, world championship medalists. Do you have that history in the past, but recently is not as good? Both of those variables can lead to sponsorship success, having legends or current stars. Well, what about your link to Canada, or the cool factor? These come back to our MVP study that Elisa mentioned earlier on. And then participants, members, non-members, are there affluent? Do you have a very wealthy participant base, or is it one that has less disposable income that a sponsor might be interested in? Is it a particular group really attractive for females or Gen Zs or whatever the group may be? And those were coded to give you some valuable as well. And then global presence. So these things all fed in to what would be a potential value for the sponsor. This then led to the next slide, which shows that they grouped up into 6 clusters. So we showed you this and this here just to give you an idea. When we got the actual primary data, it does change considerably, but we broke it up into these 6 clusters. Number 6 at the bottom being those that really need to work on building your assets. Those of you who participated know who you are because we've identified that and built it out. Up to cluster 1, which was the mega Canadian value, and you could guess who was there. But we're not going to dig into that one right now because it ended up changing quite significantly with the primary data. And with that, I'll pass it back to Elisa.
Perfect, thank you. So in terms of the second phase, this is where we really dug into that primary research. And most of that came from the surveys that you provided to us. In terms of those surveys that went out, they were live for about a month. We had 32 organizations respond, and they're listed there. And there were 8 categories of questions. We asked questions around revenue, sponsorship revenue, overall revenue. We asked questions about your events. We tried to get into some information about the types of assets that you have, the number of assets. And so there were 33 questions overall. And we also tried to go back over a number of years because we were really trying to get insight from a longitudinal perspective as well. So those 32 organizations responded, and that, if you go to the next slide, provided us with a really quite fascinating snapshot of the sort of average national sport federation in Canada. And I'm going to take some time and go through each of these because they're quite interesting. I think they're quite insightful. And it also provides an interesting sort of average NSF, understanding that there are many that fall below and there are many that fall above. But if we look at things like sponsorship in that top left-hand box there, we can see that on average, sponsorship revenue, annual sponsorship revenue was $1.2 million for the average NSF, but the median annual sponsorship revenue was about $150,000, so that's quite a bit lower there. In terms of that largest sponsor, so that's looking at about $500,000 there, and in terms of the number of sponsors that each NSF has, it's just under 9. So that gives an interesting snapshot of the average sponsorship for the average NSF. If we go to the top center bucket there, we also asked questions about the geographic focus of the sponsor. And this allowed us here, and we'll talk about it later, to compare the data that you guys are providing us with data that we've captured in the Canadian Sponsorship Landscape Study for all different types of properties from a sponsorship kind of revenue perspective. But what we do see, and this is not at all shocking, given that you guys are national organizations, that about 3 in every 4 sponsors has a national focus from a geographical perspective. We asked questions about human resources, so in terms of number of people working full-time, part-time, but also the number of people that were sort of have a bit of a dedicated role towards sponsorship. And again, that question we've asked specifically that way because that's how we've collected data from the sponsorship landscape study that allows us to compare your organization profile with those of thousands of others in Canada. So on average, the NSFs you guys have about 21 full-time staff, but about 1.7 people working over a quarter of their time on sponsorship. And then you can see there the part-time staff and a quite robust number of volunteers. If we go to events, we dug into events quite a lot because from a sponsorship standpoint, they are a really key asset. So we did learn that every NSF that responded to the survey has their own event that they are responsible for. There's an average of almost 5 national championship events on an annual basis. In terms of paid versus unpaid spectatorship, there's an average of about 30,000 paid spectators and about 7,500 unpaid spectators or attendance at national championships. Financial, this is a little bit of a profile in terms of if you kind of compare that 1.2 sponsorship revenue with overall average revenue. of 7.7 million, and then we also asked questions about contributions from COC Sport Canada. You can see those numbers broken down there. Membership. So membership is a really key metric in terms of when we think about what are sponsors going to value and what are they really going after. The average annual membership was 80,000 from those 32 NSFs that responded. On a similar kind of vein as that, from what the sponsor, from the perspective of what does the sponsor value, we asked questions around performance. So we looked at top 3 performance at world events, so things like World Cups, World Championships, Olympics in 2015, and you can see the average of 3.8 there. And then also media, so we looked at coverage of events of your sport or that your NSF gets from both a TV and also from a streaming standpoint, because both of those are really key to have some insight to, and you can see there about 430 hours on TV and then 114 or so streaming. And so that is just an interesting snapshot of the average of the sample of 32. And what this allowed us to do from all of those key variables, and Norm will take you into this a fair bit in the next couple of slides, but this really allowed us to understand, based on this information, how do the NSFs cluster up, and how do you find yourself in those clusters, and then what does it look like for you to move from cluster to cluster. So I think, Norm, then you're going to...
I am. So as Elisa said, we had all these kind of initial variables then on each of your NSFs. So now we're down to those 32, so 31 NSFs plus bowls that we looked at to get the sample of 32 from the overall population of 49. So it's a pretty good group to look at and consider kind of as we go forward. So the first step was to identify those variables which really weren't kind of saying the same thing in multiple ways. So we do what we call a factor analysis or data reduction or principal components analysis for those of you who have done stats before. Basically just a simple way to reduce down variables. And you can see the 9 there that we kind of ended up with that explain different things. And she just took you through the descriptive ones, but they're the annual revenue, the number of sponsors, assets that you had, and we came with a summary variable there, paid spectatorship at national championships turned out to be a good differentiator between NSFs. Television and streaming hours, again, a summary variable. Focus of the sponsors, as Lisa said, the national and international ones being higher valued than those that are regional or local. How much human resources you have towards it, then your membership size, and then your performance, again, a summary variable around the success of your organization in terms of on-the-field action. This led us to actually, and once again, we learned that research lesson 101, that primary research is a heck of a lot better than secondary research, and we ended up with a very different mosaic, if you will, of the NSF sponsorship landscape and value than we got from the secondary analysis, and which is good. So the data you shared with us really allowed us to differentiate a lot further and ended up coming up with a group of 9. So we have 9 different clusters that identify where you sit. Now what's really neat about this, and those that have gone through their custom strategy report, is it kind of shows you where you are, but more importantly, it shows you where you can be. So not comparing yourself to an NSF that's 3 or 4 away in one direction or the other, but to get to that next level of sponsorship value and revenue and attachment and attractiveness to sponsors, here's where we need to go. And that's usually a more facilitated and easier step to undertake, and a step that you can actually see that in the next short period of time with the right activities and actions and decisions that you can get there. And so that's what's really nice about a cluster analysis, and what we really liked about the 9, how it grouped up into these 9 different groups that can tell you where you want to go. We spent a lot of time, and we're going to go through that now in detail in the next little while, trying to figure out how do we name them, what are the differentiating attributes of each that kind of led to it. And obviously there's a lot of variability across each of your contexts in terms of sports, participants, etc., and we tried to consider that. So look at the next slide. This shows the breakdown by sport, and this is maybe the most controversial and the most interesting one. And so we have 9 clusters. Importantly, anything that's got an asterisk on there is an organization did not fully respond to the primary study, so we are using secondary data. So those ones you can take with a a bit of a grain of salt, but those that have no asterisk meant we have the real data and we're able to cluster them up. So if we start at the top end at cluster 1 comprehensive, and we were, compared to our first cluster, hockey was grouped up with a couple of the other big ones, stuck out all by itself and literally miles and miles ahead of everybody else in terms of sponsorship value and attributes, and this explains a lot, but more than we even hypothesized. Tennis sits at number 2 in terms of a lot of those variables and attributes we talked about couldn't be close enough to the others, so again, it's a cluster all by itself, and so we define those as comprehensive, which is hockey, and tentpole with tennis, which is huge events and its major stars and its major global following. So those are 1 and 2. Number 3 is the first one where we see a few groups group up, and this is we call the event assets cluster, and this is curling, golf, and soccer. So on a lot of attributes, very similar in terms of the strength of their events, reach a large portion of the population, strong sponsorship results versus comparables from non-sport properties of their size, overvaluing, so really, really effective in terms of event assets, which is cluster number 3. Cluster number 4 has alpine, basketball, rugby, and skate, and this is, we define this as international appeal, and fell in a little bit lower than cluster 3 in terms of the sponsorship revenues and size and attractors, but still very, very effective, and also tracking above properties of similar descriptions and size and scope in other industries and other fields when we did the CSLS comparison that Elisa talked about. And here we see really strong value from the international appeal, strong global games, global events, global prominence, in some cases at large, professional sport, all 4, professional sports sector around the world, really, really strong cluster. Then down to cluster number 5, which we call broad participation, and this group differentiated itself from those in cluster number 6, largely because of their large numbers of participants, mostly non-member participants, but that's a very attractive to sponsors and sponsors of events, and this with a lot of grassroots opportunities and opportunities around the Olympic Games, that these sports really kind of sat between cluster 4 and cluster 6 because of their large participation numbers, that being swimming and volleyball. Then down to cluster 6, which we defined after much discussion as cool athletes, and this is a cluster that has stars or has athletes that really are prominent. So prominently displayed, great opportunities for the sponsor to associate with the athlete, showcase their logo, showcase what they're doing, tie to them in terms of publicity and commercial. A relatively less cluttered sport than some of the others, and so that's why we kind of define this as cool athletes. And this is athletics, bobsleigh skeleton, diving, freestyle skiing, snowboarding, and speed skating. And so those are the group that kind of grouped up as cluster 6 around the cool athletes. Then down to cluster 7, and this one we struggled and couldn't really find a better name, but really there's 2 streams, and we couldn't really call them cluster 7 and 8 or cluster 7A and 7B because there's such overlap, and there's really strong similarities between this whole group in terms of what their revenues are and how many sponsors they have. Now this is one of the groups, only a few, that actually benchmarked lower than comparables in other properties, whereas the other 6 we've talked about were higher. So this is badminton, baseball, canoe kayak, cross country, cycling, equine, gymnastics, rowing, and softball. So these sports had either a high value in terms of performance, so medalists, world champions, well-known stars, or participation, high numbers of participants. Rarely did they have both, or if ever did they have both, and so we said that's why the word "or" is very carefully chosen there to be participation or performance cluster. Cluster 8 and cluster 9, and then the original model, the secondary research, we had these grouped all together. And again, as we pointed out, when you put primary data in, you learn the mistakes you make under assumptions. And there's really 2 groups here, and it's you don't want to be in number 9, but number 9 is not the end of the world. So number 9 is really those that have an absence of any real assets at all. So any event that sponsors would be really interested, other than endemic ones for small deals. Really no athletes that are performing at a high level, no ongoing grassroots of any major proportion. So really a lot of work to do. Certainly not the end of the world, but a lot of work to do, and step 1 is to start building some assets. Cluster 8 are then those organizations that have some assets and some following, and this is a group that's really underperforming versus comparable properties. So one of the differentiators we did between Cluster 8 and Cluster 9 was the benchmarking versus comparable non-sport properties for the CSLS, and this showed us that this group, biathlon, boxing, fencing, karate, luge, ski jumping, synchro, water ski, wakeboard, and weightlifting, all have stuff in place but are underperforming. So there's just an opportunity there to build on the assets that you do have, and each of you, we did build out some initial ideas around strategies for you within the Cluster 8 strategies, which we'll go through in a little bit. And then number 9 at the end was the absence, which I talked about. Really need to hit the drawing board if you want to go down the sponsorship route, or, as we've talked about before in different webinars, just stay away from it. Focus on other initiatives, athletes, performance, development of the sport, other revenue sources like fundraising and membership models and these kind of things, because you're just not ready for a significant sponsorship investment just yet. I'll pass back to Elisa. She'll do a bit of a description of each.
Perfect, thanks Norm. So what I'm going to do on the next 2 slides is dive in a little bit more to how those variables cross over with the clusters that Norm took you through. And you'll see that many of the words in here are what we would sort of call descriptive rather than perhaps with specific numbers, and that's largely due to confidentiality. Just wanted to make sure that we weren't providing anything specific, particularly in some of those cases where there's only a few NSFs per cluster. But I think it still provides a lot of great insight in terms of that spectrum of clusters from 1 to 9 across those variables that we, based on the cluster analysis, found to be significant contributors to the sponsorship value. So if we look kind of at the name rationale there, Norm did walk you through a lot of this, but the idea is that we tried to provide the clusters with names that described their sponsorship value or sponsorship potential, depending on the perspective. So with that comprehensive cluster, which we talked about being hockey, the rationale comes from the sponsorship activity covers all aspects of their organization. So it covers events, it covers athletes, covers teams, covers facilities. There's just a very, very comprehensive element to the sponsorship activity. They have very significant sponsorship revenue, as you can see there. They're far and above the others, as Norm mentioned. So that is kind of the description that we've decided to use there is significant sponsorship revenue. We talked about television and streaming. So both Cluster 1 and Cluster 2 have quite extensive coverage of their NSF either on television or via streaming. Spectatorship, people are watching these events, they're very engaged with these events, but you can see there that spectatorship, paid spectatorship specifically for those top 5 clusters is all quite robust. You can see high or very high depending on the scale there. Full-time staff on sponsorship, so you can see those first 2 clusters have at least 7 people that are full-time dedicated to sponsorship. Drops off a little bit in those event assets, but you're still looking at least 5 people working on sponsorship specifically. And then Cluster 4 and Cluster 5, about 2 or 3 people. A very big focus on national, and you can see there that sort of, as you go down the clusters, that drops a little bit. Membership, so this is an interesting one, and this is, I think, a good illustration of how the clusters are not necessarily entirely linear, because there is value to be built, and that's why you look at NSF membership and NSF performance. There is value to be built in sponsorship from different kind of points of equity. So in terms of, you look at Cluster 1, Cluster 2, they're both quite high in membership, but they also have very successful high performance and top 3 finishes, as we've seen there. And you look at Cluster 3, again, very, very similar story for that cluster. Cluster 4, the high performance drops off a little bit, but it's still certainly successful. And then for broad participation, as Norm talked about, that membership might be a little bit lower based on members of the NSF, but the participation standpoint is really a strong suit for that cluster and something that sponsors see value in, and that is a driver of the sponsorship success that they have. And then in terms of the assets, there really is, as we mentioned, this element of what sorts of assets are being offered to sponsors and how are they building up the sponsorship portfolio that you have at your NSF. And when you look at someone like a comprehensive, it's crossing many, many different areas. It's very diverse. There's a lot of different assets within each area, and it's very, very robust. Temple, that's true, but it's very much around an event. Same thing with event assets, cluster 3 there. And then you look at cluster 4 and cluster 5. There are assets, but they tend to be, again, focused in a certain area, such as broad participation for cluster 5. So those are clusters 1 through 5. The story is very similar if you go to clusters 6 to 9 on the next slide. And you can see there, as Norm mentioned, cluster 6, the major equity that we saw based on the information that was provided in the survey is the athletes as assets and the athletes as the ability to build equity for sponsors. Performance or participation, an interesting one, as Norm mentioned, that's either you're looking at, there was very little crossover. It was very much either performance or participation, but getting very similar sponsorship values out of that asset build. So there are assets around which a sponsorship could be built, and then asset absence. Really, that first step is to look at what assets want to be built before diving into sponsorship wholeheartedly. So in terms of the revenue, you can see that sort of spectrum there, moderate all the way down to very, very limited or even no sponsorship revenue at all. Streaming, you can see there, most of those are quite low in terms of television coverage and streaming, particularly compared to some of the other clusters. Same story with paid spectatorship. Same story with full-time staff. That asset absence cluster 9 had both 7, 8, and 9. It wasn't unusual to have no full-time staff dedicated to sponsorship, and that was a key differentiator from the first through 6th clusters. Focus of sponsors geographically, again, pretty fair mix of national versus local or regional. Membership, with the exception of cluster 7, tended to be low or very low. Cluster 7, many organizations that had that participation focus actually had quite significant membership, and that's something that, as Norm mentioned, this cluster underperformed compared to some of the other non-sport comparables, and I think that's a key area to focus, and we'll talk a little bit about what to focus on and where to consider yourself moving along from one cluster to another in the next couple of minutes. And then assets, where are the assets built around? When you're talking about cool athletes, a lot of the assets are very athlete focused, and that's great, and that's something to focus on. And then you look at cluster 8, where there are some assets in place, looking to build those up more robustly, so they provide the value that you want them to for sponsors. And then in asset absence, really kind of thinking very strategically about, one, is sponsorship the way you want to go, and if so, what is the asset, or what are the assets that you're offering to those sponsors, and really that first step being having that, thinking about what those assets are, and then putting a plan in place for building those assets, and then starting to think about how sponsorship can come from those.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. Hopefully you've got a really good feel now for the clusters, and we think it's really, really useful stuff. Obviously, we're biased. So the next stage, and this is also really, really useful, is the benchmarking. And so one of the neat things about this study is we have both the data that we collected as part of it, but we also have the Canadian Sponsorship Landscape Study, which allowed us to look at comparable properties. And if you could, so we have 2,200 forums. We've talked to you a lot about the CSLS, and we're able to dig into that. Again, it's imperfect data, but it's Canadian data, and collected over 10 years, and gives us a real nice benchmark to look at when we compare the NSFs to sport, and then other non-sport properties. So if we could flip to the next slide. Now, for confidentiality, this is important. Each of you in front of you that was a participant in the study will have your own value and the own value of your cluster, but because the clusters, some of them have small numbers, we've had to cut that out. So there's no line here that above the benchmarking line in the middle that shows your own sponsorship things, but I'll definitely talk in generalities, and Lisa just did as well, on what hit above and what hit below. But below the benchmarking line, and take a second, this is really useful stuff, is we're looking at comparable numbers of organizations with same metrics. So the metrics are the ones above the line. So how much staff you have, your focus on international, your annual budgets. These variables allowed us to look at the 3,200 responses down to those that were properties, which is about 2/3 of those, and pull out the ones that were similar to your situation. So these could be sport, arts, education, festivals, no matter what, media sponsors, but that's similar metrics on those things in terms of value as a comparable. And so you can see in the first line there, if you look at, this is by cluster, if we just take cluster 1, there's 87 organizations that are define themselves as amateur sport from the landscape study that we drew as comparables, and 278 from all properties that fit the same metrics. And you can go across the board for each one of the clusters. This was a huge exercise to dig into that data and pull these out, and so you can see the size ranges. So we have pretty reasonable sample sizes to deal with to compare between them. Now the third and fourth line are really important. So that shows the average sponsorship revenue for all of the comparables, either in the 87 on the first row would be the 6.8 million, or the 278 would be the 6.5 million. That means of those 278 properties in the CSLS, their average sponsorship revenue was $6.5 million. So as we mentioned, those in the comprehensive tentpole and event assets category sport are performing way higher than comparables across the board. And then as we work our way down, you can see the amateur sport revenues. So for example, an asset build were $86,000, which was quite a bit higher than most of you that responded that are in that category where we're underperforming. And then and $25,000 outside of sport. So amateur sport does much, much better at the smaller end. Real positive for those of you that fall in categories or clusters 7, 8, or 9. The data says benchmarking-wise there's lots of opportunity to grow. And then you can see if you can move yourself up a cluster, this is where the thresholds go. So if you're in cluster 7 and you can get your asset base up to cluster 6, you can quite easily expect a 3-fold increase in your sponsorship revenues if you got up to number 5, number 4, and so on. So that's the idea of the clustering effect, is you can see where you are and where you can kind of fall. And then at the bottom, you see the number of sponsors. So the bottom two columns then say, okay, for those the 6.8 million in revenue for clusters 1, 2, and 3, the third row in amateur sport, that came from 44 different sponsors. So on average, those organizations had 44 sponsors. And you can see as you go down the list. So that fits what Elisa told you before. As we go down the list, you have fewer sponsors and fewer assets on which to leverage them. So that gives you an idea of the benchmarking. Then you take your own numbers and you can compare to them and see where you should be and where you could be if you move up a cluster or two. And I'll pass it back to Elisa.
And that's exactly kind of what Norm said here. So every NSF in each report got their own slide that had 3 columns in it. And so the first column was the information that you provided to us in the survey. So how many full-time staff, the geographic focus of sponsors, and your budget, as well as we also included the sponsorship revenue. Then we identified what your cluster metrics were. So based on the cluster that you're in, what is the average across that cluster, including some of the other NSFs. And that would allow you to say, well, I'm actually well below what my cluster is, or I'm well above what my cluster is, and you can then kind of take that information and use it as needed. But what we also wanted to do was show that there are target clusters. So for organizations that are perhaps performing at or above their cluster target, what can be done to continue to improve the sponsorship revenue and sponsorship value that you have for your sponsors. And so we provided what cluster number you should consider targeting. And just for example, just to illustrate, when we talk about a cluster like cluster number 7, where we had cluster 7 could be performance or participation, we let those NSFs know from a performance standpoint that they should move to a certain cluster, and we let the NSFs from a participation standpoint know that they should be moving to a certain cluster. And so we really wanted to think about not only where are you performing, not only where is your target performing, but on a bit more of a longer term planning exercise for you, and to have that data to use where that target cluster might be for you to build a little bit more of a strategic long-term plan for, and that's where a lot of the strategy, strategies and tactics that we built out a little bit later on come from.
Right, and then now we're going to get into the last two phases, which are the case studies and then the strategy. Just quickly before Elisa starts off the strategy part, you also, and for those that participated in the final step, have received the casebook. And this is something we're really, really pleased with and worked out really, really well, and we base this on the clusters. And so, as you all know, when you're pitching a sponsor or building a sponsorship strategy, you're always looking for comparables or similar situations. So within that casebook, there's nearly 100 cases of sponsorships around the world. And so we made sure that we had them in 4 areas by cluster. So something from your cluster in your sport is included in there, 1 for each of the 9. Something by your cluster that's comparable to its size and scope, but that's non-sport, is included in there. Something that's in Canada that's from your sport comparable is in there as well, as an international example of a national sport federation, non-Canadian, obviously, being international, is in there as well. So you've got an enormous resource. The cases are relatively brief in terms of a casebook, but we show kind of who's involved, what they are, but they also have the contact information of where to go to click and read about them, see more about them, where we found them, some were the actual sites, some were industry reports, etc., that you can draw from. So that should be an enormous tool. And I know Dave has been, I think Dave is willing, for those that did not participate, to share that casebook with you as well to help with your sponsorship efforts. So if you're one of the 17 NSFs that are here that did not participate in the actual deep dive, I'm sure he's willing to share that with you. An enormous resource as you try to build out your decks and show sponsors comparable situations where people have undertaken sponsorships in similar groups. And I'll pass back to Elisa to take us through the strategic part of our talk.
Perfect. So the next couple of slides are very much focused on the strategy, and that kind of concludes the formal part of our presentation, and then hopefully we'll have a lot of time for questions afterwards. But there are 3 types of strategies or tactics that we've provided each NSF with. So there are what we call strategies for all clusters. So regardless of what cluster you're in, we wanted to highlight 3 really, really important areas of sponsorship, and that is activation, servicing, and evaluation. So I'll go through those fairly quickly. Then the second part is we had tactics for all clusters. So there were some very specific tactics that emerged that we really thought all clusters could benefit from. So for example, and Norm will take you through these in a little bit more detail, but something around getting the sponsorship expertise needed, regardless of where you're at. That could look very, very different, but building that sponsorship expertise is something from a tactical standpoint that all NSFs can really benefit from. And then there were cluster-specific tactics that we will take you through and that we tried to highlight for each NSF specifically in terms of how those tactics by cluster could really, really apply to you. So on 20 here, there are 3 strategies that we thought applied to all clusters, built around activation, servicing, and evaluation. And so these are really, really, they can't be highlighted enough when we talk about sponsorship. It's really, really important to invest and set aside money to activate and build. It might not necessarily be money, it could be resources, but work with your partner very, very closely to help them activate, because activation is really where you're going to demonstrate value to your sponsor, and the sponsor is going to be able to really highlight, and it doesn't just become a rights fee transaction. They're able to get the message out, they're able to activate and provide great insight and great information and share the word about the sponsorship. If we go to 21, we can look at servicing. So servicing, really treat your sponsor as that client that they are, and be really, really great to them, and that's what's going to set you apart. So the sponsor is getting serviced by very likely more than one organization, and and you're sort of competing for their attention in that way. So there are some bullet points that we've laid out there, but really offer best-in-class servicing. So be very clear on deliverables, have a very clear relationship owner or contact person that they know they can reach out to with questions or concerns, have regular updates, regular status meetings, and this is really important to be something that happens regularly and not wait till that renewal conversation needs to happen, because that can be a very difficult conversation to have if you haven't spent the term of the agreement building that relationship up. And that's where we get to evaluation. So regardless of the size of the deal, regardless of the resource base that you have, it's very important to think about evaluation. And that could be very, very different. That doesn't necessarily mean that you need to go out and do a $75,000 consumer study. That could be some very simple metrics, could be having a conversation about objectives. And so there are a lot of ways to do that. But we really wanted to highlight that across the board, regardless of what NSF you are and regardless of what industry sponsorship is happening, so this is true for music, festivals, all sorts of sponsorship, to really, really do activation, servicing, and evaluation very, very well. So if we go on to 22, I'll turn it over to Norm to take you guys through this a little bit more.
Great. So we just have 2 slides left, but they're relatively dense. So what we decided to do here, because obviously those that participated have your strategy built out in front of you. So we went through kind of building what Elisa just did and pulled out some things that are really relevant for all clusters. And then we've done a couple of high-level things on the next slide that we'll each take you through parts of them that are specific for each cluster. And these are things that came out from the research, from the whole process of the last 7 months or so that we really dug into this. And so there's 12 here. We'll go through them quickly, maybe skip a couple. Some of them are pretty intuitive. Number one, and we've actually given some ideas to each of you in your strategy here, but really focus on that ladder effect of the cluster. So how do we get up to that next cluster? Get your board buy-in. When your board is telling you that you got to get more sponsors in this, you've now got some benchmarking. Hey, you know what? In our group, $15,000 per year is the average revenue for Canadian properties of this size. So don't go thinking we're going to sign a $500,000 deal. But we can work our way up to the next cluster where we can start talking about getting 80 or 100,000 a year. And maybe 5 or 10 years from now, we're talking about getting to the cluster 6 and having $300,000 per year. Gives you some evidence, some support to buy into that process if your organization is going to go after sponsorship. Number 2, really look at your existing properties and figure out what you can do to build them up with owned properties. So do you own your national championships? If not, how do you get control of it? Is that a partnership deal with somebody? How do you really create that? Are there new events you can create? Are there new opportunities you can build your stuff around? Do you have a current event that's just kind of blah, that you can make like a festival so people would actually come, that would be spectators or participants or supporters, that would create an atmosphere that people could really build into? Looking at your number 3 and building your whole ideas around longer term. I mean, there's a lot of examples we saw and got feedback from you all on of a one-off that had various, non-kind of strategic reasons why it happened. That's not sustainable in long term. Really focus on an evergreen stuff. 4, focus on revenue per sponsor, not total sponsors. As the data you saw showed, a lot of sports and a lot of non-sport properties have lots of sponsorships but not much revenue. Think about those that actually can bring you some revenue to help your organization, your other initiatives. Focus on rights fees, number 5, plus activation spend, not right fees alone. So one of the things we saw was that those that are successful at sponsorship in the lower numbered clusters have sponsors who actually activate. And so make sure your sponsors, when you do get them, are investing more dollars into activate. Look at value in kind. Our analysis on the CSLS showed that the clusters 6 through 9 really aren't getting the endemic sponsorship that they should. It's a great place to start. It's a great place to build the resources. It's a great place to have impact on your budget, even though it's not new cash. It frees up other resources to do other things. 7, be a platform. We hear this from sponsors in the CSLS, and really think about how do you let your sponsor activate, do what they want to do, reach your membership base, reach your participants, leverage your athletes. It's hard to do, but that's the kind of thing. Think about being a platform for them and they can succeed. Co-sponsorship. This is a real trend in the last 2 years of the CSLS that some of you have probably heard either of us talk about, and that's really trying to get your sponsors to partner amongst themselves to further your brand. So if you're fortunate enough to have more than one good sponsor, get them talking to each other. From the MVP study, we've really learned about heritage, cause-related benefits, and sponsor fit, all things which NSFs have really strong, in most cases, affinity towards. Build that into your prospecting and sales. Build that into opportunities that they can address or create properties or assets around. Number 10, try to really differentiate your sponsorship efforts or asset building efforts from your performance. As you've seen there, performance leads to sponsorship in a lot of cases. In the performance or participation, there are sports that have very few participants but have high performance and that are matching, if not exceeding, the revenues of those with massive participation numbers. So really try to keep those things exclusive. Allow your sport technical and your high performance teams to do their job without impacting it to help sponsorship. Digital presence, pretty intuitive, got to build that up. And then getting some people on your staff that have sponsorship experience and skills and ability to sell and understand is something we learn every year from the CSLS. And in smaller organizations, the higher clusters, that's certainly an issue. And then on to the last slide that we want to kind of cover today. And this is kind of specific to each cluster. So I'm going to take us through 1 to 5, and Elisa will finish us off with 6 to 9. And so what we did here, and this is just a sample of some of the things that we're showing to the different organizations. So for cluster 1 and 2, I won't spend a lot of time, but these ones, cluster 1 clearly at the top of the NSF pile, if you will, time to benchmark off professional sport or major national festivals, that next level up of organization, not just being happy with where the organization is, but trying to really move up from there, looking at other global properties that have a huge national affinity. We gave cricket in India as one particular example. In the cluster 2, the tentpole cluster, this is really looking at other secondary properties to really support those tentpole events that are really driving sponsorship. And so that's developing programs or a next level event or athlete sponsorship opportunities that can really provide additional revenues but also additional branding and awareness opportunities if something was ever to happen to those major events. Down to cluster 3, which is where more of the NSFs are starting to fall. This is really thinking about how do we move from 3 to 2. So how do you take one of those events that you have and create a true tentpole? How do you take a local auto racing event and turn it into an Indianapolis 500? Like, that's the kind of analogy, right? How do you turn a golf event and turn it into the Masters? So this kind of thing, how do you take an event that you have and really ramp it up to be a global, international sponsorship driver? And then really within that, leveraging digital event and other platforms is something that cluster 2 is doing that cluster 3 isn't. Down to cluster 4, international appeal. So this is a group that's trying to move up to cluster number 3. And this is really thinking about how do we take our international assets. And some of the group that you saw there are doing a very good job of this. And so whether it's athletes, events, using streaming or digital or television to get those international properties, some reach and some coverage here in Canada. How do we strategically build these activation programs to target groups outside of Canada or within Canada with international properties? Really building up that link to a global sport is one of the key tactics and characteristics of cluster number 4. Cluster number 5, we get down to broad participation. And so these are those swimming and volleyball were the two that were the members here. And this is where you've got the big numbers. But really it's thinking about how do we build programs for our non-members as well as our members that sponsors can activate that we would have some kind of control over. Very challenging to do, but major open tournaments, some kinds of festivals, events that people could participate in, they're examples that we've shown in the casebook. And then really thinking about some grassroots sponsorship programs. And I'll pass it to Elisa to finish it off with 6 to 9.
Perfect. So cluster 6 really about the athlete and making sure that the stars that you have are built into the sponsorship. It's also about keeping an eye out for other stars from a sport performance standpoint, but also what they bring off the field from a charismatic standpoint too can be very, very important. And the other thing with this is to position yourself to capitalize when they do have great moments. So there is that momentum when something happens, and making sure that you as an NSF are able to capitalize on that from a sponsorship and a story creation perspective. Cluster 7, performance or participation. So wherever that strength is that you have, being very aware of it, being very cognizant of it, and building your assets and sponsorship around whether it be performance focused or whether it be participation focused, and then building up to and moving from that cluster up to either cluster 5, cluster 6. Asset build, so this is really about leveraging those assets that you do have and packaging them and building them into something that is sponsorable. There is a big opportunity in this cluster to focus on endemic sponsors and sponsors that are a part of your sport, and really doing that effectively and well, really building a robust kind of value-added value in kind, and positioning it that way. And then cluster 9, what's really important here is to review whether sponsorship makes sense. It might be that your resources and your time is better spent elsewhere, and sponsorship is not it's not easy, and it's not a solution that solves all sorts of problems. And so it's something to really consider, the kind of cost benefit of pursuing sponsorship. And if you do go into sponsorship, think about what are those assets that you have to offer sponsors, and start to focus on building those assets up rather than going straight to selling them to sponsors. And it might need to be a little bit more of a longer term play. So those are the tactics that we have for each cluster. Each NSF has those expanded upon a little bit, specifically related to their context and their information and the data that we had. But overall, there were tactics. Those are the tactics that apply to the clusters that we had established earlier on in the analysis. So that takes us to page 24, which is our contact information. We are certainly willing to answer questions directly if you'd like to reach out and let us know, but I will turn it over to Dave right now.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks, Norm. I had a couple of questions for you, and again, for those of you in the audience, just over on the right-hand side of the screen, you can use the chat window over there to ask any questions you may have. But you mentioned earlier about going through this report with your board. Given that sponsorship can be a bit of a sensitive issue, both from a commercial perspective and also in terms of differing expectations, do you have a suggestion for how to bring this up with the board, how to go through this conversation?
I can go if you like. I popped my face up. Yeah, having been, like a lot of you are, in those chairs in the past, and then I've also sat and continue to sit on a number of boards, I know from experience that it's a very challenging place, particularly if you're in clusters 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9. You've got that dual pressure of yourself wanting to achieve revenues and new resources from your internal organization, the high-performance people, the athletes, the coaches, etc., and a board, and we mentioned this a bit earlier, that also often has unrealistic expectations. They may read somewhere that some pro team just got $4 million a year for an MLS shirt deal, right? And so you've got that to compare with. So this, I think, is the greatest tool. It's a tool I would have loved to have when I was in these positions with NSFs a number of years ago, to say, you know what, this is what we're worth. This is what market value is for us versus comparables in our cluster and NSFs versus amateur sport comparables generally, so that could be any type of amateur sport property, versus Canadian properties generally, that could be any type, that have similar sizes and scopes. So the same number of staff putting some of their time towards sponsorship. They got the same range of overall annual budgets. They've got the same scope in terms of a national or international reach. They're not some local thing that's got a connection with a local sponsor. So people that have the same reality as us, this is what they're getting. Here's where we sit. We're above, below, in between. Here's where we can go. That's step one. That's a great tool. Second tool is the kind of the vertical one that Elisa took you through. Is that here's where we sit. We're in cluster 5. We're in cluster 3. We're in cluster 9. Whatever. We want to move up. And so here's what comparable NSFs are doing that we're not. And some of those things we can't replace. We can't immediately quadruple our membership, but we can start to work towards that. But there are pieces we can start to build towards in a 5-year plan or a 3-year plan or a 10-year plan that can get us up the line, and then they can make an informed decision and say, okay, is it worth the return? Because now we know what on average NSFs and those higher clusters are getting in terms of annual revenues, what average amateur sport properties are getting in terms of revenues, and what on average just general properties are getting in revenues. Is it worth investing 25% of the CEO or executive director's time if we might get another $125,000 a year and we have to hire someone and do all this work? No. Let's just let it happen naturally, and let's focus our resources on other things like winning medals, building a fundraising program, developing youth, whatever the objective might be that your organization has to deal with it. So for me, Dave, it gives you those tools both horizontally and vertically, if you want to use our slides as a benchmark, to really make that argument and allow your board and yourselves to make an informed decision about sponsorship.
Thanks very much, Norman. I appreciate your time on that, because I think that's an important use of this tool, is to come to an agreement with the board about where you stand. And one more question before we wrap up around, you talked about developing a tentpole event, and your analogy was the Indianapolis 500. And for a sport that has a national championship that maybe has modest attendance and is really important in the community, but still struggling to reach outside the community, is there a definition of tentpole that's maybe a little more attainable than that sort of broad international reach of a Rogers Cup or an Indianapolis 500?
Yeah, great question, and I'll let Elisa jump in too when I'm done. She may have something to add. So I think the example that we often use, and that I've actually been a part of a panel with their marketing director, is Ontario Lacrosse. And so I think, Dave, your point's a good one, and maybe I overstated it, but the analogy is to say, okay, we've got something. How do we make it bigger? And they've got a great example of how they turned their series of small provincial lacrosse championships, junior, U23, pro men, pro women, whatever it is, and put it all together. And they create, now it's annual, it's always held in the same spot, east of Toronto. They've now got sponsorship that's well into six figures. It's spectators come, lacrosse lovers come. They've multi-levels of masters, of high performance. They've created a festival. So is that the Indianapolis 500? Absolutely not. But for lacrosse, the analogy would be, yeah, you've taken a regular bunch of events and created your Indianapolis 500. So yeah, apologies for the analogy, but the idea is, how do you think about creating what's the top for your particular sport? So obviously, as you go down the clusters from 1 through 9, you would think about, okay, where do I sit? What does a tentpole look like? And if you're getting $3,000 or $4,000 in in-kind sponsorship from endemic sponsors for your national championships, and you can move that up to be a $100,000 cash contribution for some larger national championship, you could argue that that's a tentpole for your group. Very specifically to Cluster 2, which is where tennis sits, and Cluster 3, where those other four sit, you could say very specifically, if we're one of those four sports, how from a sponsorship perspective can we turn our hosted World Cup or the Canadian Open or et cetera to that next level up where tennis is at in terms of getting sponsorship. Is that good?
That's great. Thanks, Norm. I appreciate that. And as we're wrapping up here, I want to talk a little bit about our upcoming webinar. So we have one coming next week with Denny Young of Denny Young and Associates to talk about a philanthropy development tool that he's led for us, and it will be incredibly useful as people in the NSF community work to round out their revenue plan. I'd also like to point out from Norm, from his answer just now about Ontario Lacrosse, we will be sending you a YouTube link to the archive of this webinar in the next week or so. In there, once you're in there, you'll be able to see on our YouTube page for NSF Enhancement a previous webinar we did with Mark Eckert, the CEO of Volleyball Canada, where they did something very similar, put some disparate events together, made something much bigger, and created a tentpole in just the manner that Norm just talked about. So there's another example out there that you can follow up on. So with that, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, Norm. Elisa, thank you for all your great work on this project as well as on the webinar today. And thanks to everybody for joining us. Again, we'll see you hopefully next week, June 13th, to talk about philanthropy. Until then, I'm Dave Patterson, and have a great day, everybody.